He controlled 3 out of every 4 matches struck anywhere on Earth. Whole governments borrowed from him, and when it ended, investigators found that almost none of his fortune was real. His name was Ivar Kreuger. It is the morning of March 12, 1932 in Paris, and the man they call the Match King, the richest financier in Europe, is about to be found dead behind a locked door. On paper, he was worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He had lent more money to governments than some of those governments kept in reserve. Within weeks, auditors would discover that $250 million of it had never existed at all. This is exactly how one quiet Swedish engineer built the biggest financial empire on Earth out of other people's money and forged paper. And how a single honest audit brought all of it down. To understand the fraud, you have to start with something uncomfortable. For most of his life, Ivar Kreuger was not a swindler. He was brilliant, and he was real. He was born in Kalmar, Sweden, in 1880. He trained as an engineer, sailed to America as a young man, and there he learned a new way to build with steel and poured concrete. Back in Sweden, he founded a construction firm and made a bold promise no rival would dare. He would finish every building on a fixed date, or pay a penalty for each day he was late. He kept the promise. His firm poured the foundations of the Stockholm Olympic Stadium and the city's grandest halls, always on time. By his early 30s, Ivar Kreuger was rich, respected, and completely legitimate. Then he turned to the humblest product imaginable, the match. Every home on Earth needed them, bought them constantly, and threw them away. It was the perfect business. Small, cheap, and endless. In 1917, he merged Sweden's matchmakers into one giant company, Swedish Match. Then he began buying up match factories across Europe, one country at a time. Soon, he did not just sell matches, he controlled them. 2 out of every 3 matches in the world, then 3 out of every 4, were made by companies that answered to one man in Stockholm. By now, Kreuger was far more than a manufacturer. Presidents and prime ministers sought his counsel on the ruined finances of Europe, and the newspapers began to call him its savior. And his empire had spread far past matches. He controlled telephone companies, iron mines, forests, and banks in a dozen countries. To the world, he looked like the safest industrial fortune on Earth. The newspapers gave him a title, the Match King. But matches were never the real game. They were the stage. And in a few short years, this same name would mean fraud itself. Not yet. Here is where the real machine begins. Europe, after the Great War, was broke. Governments were desperate for cash to rebuild. And Ivar Kreuger arrived offering exactly that. His offer was simple and irresistible. He would lend a government millions of dollars at a fair rate. In return, that government would give him one thing: the exclusive right to make and sell every match in the country. It was a monopoly, guaranteed by law. Every citizen who ever lit a stove or a cigarette would now pay, in the end, into Kreuger's pocket. A tiny tax on a whole nation's fire. The deals came fast. $75 million to France. $125 million to Germany, his largest loan of all. Poland, Hungary, Romania, and on, around 15 governments in the end. It looked like the safest empire in the world. Real factories, real monopolies, real governments signing real contracts. But there was one question almost nobody thought to ask. Where was Kreuger getting all this money to lend? The answer is the whole trick. The money was not his. He raised it from ordinary investors, especially in America, by selling them his own shares and bonds. Their savings flowed in. He passed it on to governments, and he kept the monopolies for himself. In the United States alone, he sold about $148 million of securities. His company's stock was among the most widely owned in America. Teachers, widows, and clerks put their savings into the Match King, certain it was as safe as a government itself. And he had built a clever lock on the whole empire. Kreuger invented a special class of shares that carried almost no vote. He could sell them to the public by the millions, take in the cash, and never lose control of a single company. It worked beyond belief. His stock rose tenfold in a few short years. His securities became some of the most widely owned in all of America. Everyone wanted a piece of the Match King, and here is the piece that turned a business into a trap. Kreuger paid enormous dividends, as much as 30%, year after year, far more than his companies actually earned. So where did those dividends come from? Not from profit. He paid the old investors with the money handed in by the new ones. It is the oldest trap in finance. And as long as new money kept arriving, no one could tell the difference. To keep anyone from seeing the whole, Kreuger built a maze. Hundreds of companies, subsidiaries inside subsidiaries, spread across the world. Money moved between them so quickly that no outsider could follow it. Only one man understood the whole picture, and he made sure of it. Kreuger kept the real books himself. His outside accountants were shown neat summaries he prepared and asked to trust them. For years they did, and that is the first thing that should have stopped it, and did not. The most trusted financier in the world was never truly audited. The men paid to check his numbers simply wrote down what he told them. On his books, the empire looked colossal, hundreds of millions in assets. But investigators would later find that $400 million of it was listed only as vague other investments. Much of it was worth nothing. For years, it worked. The dividends flowed, the stock climbed, and Ivar Kreuger was called the savior of Europe. But here is what almost nobody knew. The whole machine only survived if new money never stopped, and in 1929, it stopped. The Wall Street crash tore through the world. Credit froze. Frightened investors stopped buying and started asking for their money back. The one thing Kreuger's empire could not survive was a demand to see the cash. The first quiet warnings had already appeared. A Swiss banker cautioned that Kreuger and Toll could fail. But the Match King seemed far too vast to fall, and almost no one listened. Then came the deal that should have exposed everything. In 1931, Kreuger sold the American telephone giant ITT, a controlling stake in one of his finest companies, the Swedish firm Ericsson, for $11 million. But this time, the buyer sent in its own accountants, and they found something strange. Much of the company's cash was not cash at all. It was really just claims on Kreuger's own other companies. The books had been quietly dressed up. ITT was furious. It demanded its $11 million back and to undo the whole deal. Kreuger promised that he would repay. He did not have the money. The net was closing, and he knew it. Kreuger did what he had always done. He borrowed more to cover the gap. He begged banks in Sweden and America for new loans. By early 1932, what he owed to the banks of Sweden reached nearly half of the whole country's currency reserve. Now the lenders wanted something new. Not promises, collateral. Hard assets they could hold as security. Sweden's central bank told Kreuger plainly, "Show us the real accounts, or there is no more money." Kreuger had no real accounts to show. What he did next is the act that would destroy him. He decided to manufacture the collateral. He would forge it by his own hand. He chose the bonds of a great nation, Italy. Kreuger had a printer strike 42 blank bond certificates. Then, alone, he signed them himself with the forged names of Italian government officials, pledging them as proof of $142 million he did not have. It was an astonishing risk. The richest financier in the world, forging paper like a common counterfeiter, and he made mistakes. Investigators later said the forged signatures were wrong, and even the Italian words on the bonds were misspelled. For a few weeks, the forged bonds did their job. They looked real enough to calm the bankers and buy Kreuger a little more time. But time was the one thing he could not afford. The audit was already coming. Think of what was now balanced on those forged pages. The savings of thousands of American families, loans to a dozen governments, and one man in a Paris apartment, running out of both money and lies. In March 1932, Kreuger sailed back to Europe to face his creditors. In Paris, bankers were waiting with hard questions. A meeting was set for Berlin, where he would have to explain the missing money and the strange Italian bonds. On March 11th, Kreuger met two associates in his Paris apartment. He seemed calm. He told them he would be ready for the meeting. Then he was alone. The next morning, March 12, 1932, Ivar Kreuger was found dead in his apartment. A pistol lay nearby. The French police ruled it a suicide. He was 52 years old, and he left short notes for the people he had failed. These were not only bankers. They were teachers and clerks and widows across 3 continents who had trusted the safest name in finance. If you believe the people ruined by frauds like this deserve to be remembered, the like button is how their story reaches the next person. For decades afterward, his own brother insisted it was not suicide at all, but murder, to keep the empire's secrets buried. No evidence ever proved it, and the official verdict has always stood. But the true scandal was not how he died. It was what he left behind. With Kreuger dead, the banks sent in outside accountants from the firm Price Waterhouse to open the real books at last. What they found stunned even them. The famous Italian bonds were fakes. The vast other investments were mostly empty. One investigator wrote that the manipulations were so childish that anyone with a basic knowledge of bookkeeping could see the books were false. The numbers were staggering. Around $250 million in claimed assets simply did not exist. When the wreckage was counted, investors had lost sums reckoned in the hundreds of millions. In the end, they recovered under half of what they had put in. The collapse spread like fire. Kreuger and Toll went bankrupt within weeks. His great American banking house, Lee Higginson and Company, was ruined and closed its doors. The Match King's fall became one of the largest bankruptcies the world had ever seen. One economist would later call Ivar Kreuger the Leonardo of larcenists, the greatest financial swindler who ever lived. Not because he stole the most, but because of how completely he had fooled the cleverest men of his age. But the most important part of this story is not the fortune that vanished. It is what the shock forced the world to change. Because Kreuger's collapse exposed a terrifying truth about how business was done. Before Kreuger, a public company could sell its shares to the world without ever showing an outsider its true accounts. Investors were simply asked to trust the man in charge. He had proven, at devastating cost, exactly how dangerous that trust could be. So the United States acted. Shaken in part by the Kreuger disaster, Congress passed the Securities Act of 1933 and the Securities Exchange Act of 1934. For the first time, companies selling shares to the public had to tell the truth, in writing, and prove it. Those laws created the rule that public companies must publish accounts checked by an independent auditor. They helped build the modern accounting standards and the regulator that still guard the markets today. The man who hid everything forced the world to require that companies show everything, and yet the trick never fully died. The very method Kreuger perfected, hiding debt inside a maze of companies just off the books, would surface again 70 years later in the collapse of Enron. The names change. The machine does not. Ivar Kreuger controlled 3 out of every 4 matches on Earth, lent fortunes to nations, and was mourned as a genius the day he died. It took one honest look at his books to reveal there had been almost nothing there at all. He had built his empire out of the one thing that always burns out: a match and a lie. If you want the true stories of how the greatest financial crimes in history were built and finally undone, subscribe. There is a new one coming.